Okay, perfect. Let's try that again. Yeah, so just kind of answer Jay Dirk's question. Yeah, so typically a honeybee colony does its best when it's around 40 liters. Um, you know, beekeepers keep them up to 80 liters, but even larger, they probably won't do as well. But 40 liters is really what you're aiming for a typical colony, which is what a typical Langstroth colony is. He also asked when a queen swarms out of a hive, how long till a new queen is born? Then how long till mating and then laying? Yeah, so typically when a colony swarms, they'll produce a new queen beforehand. So they won't swarm out until the new queen emerges, and then they'll swarm out. So typically that's gonna be happening right away. Now a queen takes 16 days to get from an egg to an adult queen, and then another 5 days for her to go on her mating flights, and then probably another week or so before she actually starts laying. And so if you add that all up, it'll be somewhere between, 3 to 4 weeks or so before she starts, finishes mating and actually starts laying. Okay, perfect. So, yeah, sorry about that beforehand. I just want to make sure all the noise was all good, but I think we should be good now with all the mowing and the vacuuming. So, before 1600s, we talked about the different ways that beekeepers manage colonies. And so, when these beekeepers were in kind of desert area environments, they made basically honeybee colonies out of kind of clay and mud. You kind of these cylinder tubes. And so this is, but once you get to certain parts of the world, they had a lot more forests and trees available, and bees were kind of forming colonies in basically tree trunks. And so in Northern Europe, they managed bees different ways. So some beekeepers managed them in these kind of clay cylinder pots where the bees were kept in here and they had an entrance to come in and out. So they were kind of put on the side. And you can see on this cover, there's kind of a small opening, and this allowed the bees to fly in and out. But also Northern Europe, they had trees. And so sometimes they would cut down the trees and then form basically manage honeybee colonies into these trees. And so this area you can kind of cut out and get inside the honeybee colony. Sometimes they would cut down, trees and then manage them that way. And so this is an apiary in, I think, northern Europe or so, where you can see all these cut down trees. They had managed colonies inside of these. And so, especially in areas where there's a lot of forests and trees available, beekeepers are managing them not only in these clay mud pots, but also in these trees. And this was pretty common on 2000 BC onwards. But then around kind of later on, beekeepers started managing them in these skeps. Now, if you look at one problem with these clay pots, right, they're really heavy, and if you have a lot of them in one area, you can't really move them, and they're harder to manage. And so right around, maybe 500 to, 1,000 years ago, beekeepers produced these skeps. So these are basically woven colonies that are lighter, easier to move, and easier to access the honeybee colonies. And so this is a picture from Bern, Switzerland of this beekeeper. You can see kind of the old bee suit that they had, but they started managing them in these skeps. If you've ever seen one of these skeps, they're very light, they're easy to move, and that was really beneficial to a lot of people. Now this is really common in Europe. Beekeepers are managing them in skeps in Africa and other parts of the world until later on, but really around that kind of Switzerland, Germany area, France, Great Britain, they're managing honeybee colonies in these skeps. And this is what these skeps look like. So this is just a beekeeper that made these skeps. I think you can buy these on Etsy and some other places if you want to manage them in skeps. Now, I will say that it's illegal in Texas to manage honeybee colonies in skeps because in the state of Texas, we need to have removable frames. And so, as much as I would love to manage a few skeps here in Texas, it's illegal for us to do that. But they're really cool colonies. They're kind of woven with straw and string, and you see the honeybee colonies are formed underneath these. So basically, there's a small entrance. You can tilt it over the side, and you can cut out the comb to access the honey and the wax. Now, the problem with this is you're basically destroying the entire colony unless you're taking a few frames out. It's kind of similar to a top colony that way. They form really small colonies, so they're more likely to swarm. But for beekeepers, it's really valuable because it's easier to move these colonies. So, if you're in an area where there's not a lot of resources for the bees, beekeepers, thousands of years ago could use these skeps to easily move colonies between different locations. Now, they're made from straw or wicker, and skeps gave bees sheltered and made them more transportable. It also increased honey harvesting. So a lot of beekeepers have managed multiple colonies and collect more honey from kind of wild nests. Because beforehand it's really hard to access some of these colonies. It's really hard to, get the honey and wax from. And so this really changed the way we kept bees and led more to beekeepers, thousands of years ago. And these are probably the early managed colonies. So they brought, bees and humans closer and laying the groundwork for how we manage colonies now. And so as we get into Langstroth colonies and removable frames, the person, Lorenzo Langstroth, used this as a model to understand the bee space and understand how to develop the removable frames that we still manage today. But it all started with these skeps. Now, I do want to talk about Mayan beekeeping. And so we think about, Mexico, right? Honeybees weren't imported into the United States until around 1622. But in Mexico and with the Mayans, they managed the sugar baked bees or the stingless bees. And so this is a picture of the Australian stingless bees. And so it's a different species in Mexico, but they manage this for their honey, their wax, and their resin. And here's a video of the stingless bees. And don't worry about the sound, it's just a background sound. You can see the queen right there. Yeah, these single speeds are really cool, and like I said, they form these kind of spiral patterns. I'll show this graphic again. So, these are different species of stingless bees, but you can see you have this kind of circular spiral pattern. They do produce a little bit of honey, but not nearly as much as the honeybees that we manage today. But they also produce a lot of resin. But one thing that was really valuable for the Mayans was using this for wax and religious ceremonies. And so wax was when people think about honeybees, they think that people wanted honeybees for the honey, but largely honeybees were brought into the United States and used for their wax to make candles and for different religious ceremonies. Now, Melipona bees, they lack a stinger, so they can't sting you. So that's why we call them stingless bees. We also call them sugar baked bees based on their honey, but they protect their colony by biting and using plant resins to block intruders. So this resin is really important for blocking any intruders from getting into the colony. But if you've ever been bitten by it does hurt a little bit, not nearly as much as a sting, but they have this intensive biting behavior. They're really important pollinators for avocado, guava, and chaya. And they're known as the world ladybee because their honey is kind of this tangy flavor, antimicrobial, and it was treasured in the Mayans for healing and for other traditions. And so the sugar baked honey was a really important resource for medicinal purposes. And so kind of like how we view it now that, a lot of honey we're consuming, it's for medicinal purposes, maybe using it for your allergies. People have been using honey for these same reasons for hundreds and thousands of years. They're traditionally kept in these kind of hollow logs called jaw bones, or found in tree cavities sealed with resin and wax. And like I said, it's deeply rooted in Mayan culture and ceremony. And so, especially in North America, we've had beekeepers for a long time, not necessarily for honeybees, but for these melliponeless or stingless bees. Now, this is what one of the Mayan colonies look like. So this is sort of a clay rock honeybee colony with these kind of rock circular pods. And so this is how they manage it. So similar to kind of the clay pots. And it's kind of funny how people across the world kind of came to the same conclusion how to make a honeybee colony in these cylinders. They probably found the exact same size. I mean, this is probably around 40 liters, but they came to really the same conclusion, whether you're in Mexico or whether you're in um, Northern Europe or Egypt. But yeah, you can see the small opening for the entrance for the honeybee colonies getting out. They have this removable cover to access the colony and extract the honey and wax. And so these Mayan beekeepers would manage large amounts of these honeybee colonies for their honey and their wax. Or not honeybee colonies, sorry, stingless bee colonies. Now, one thing I want to mention because we always talk about that honeybees are non-native to the United States, and as I get into the next slide, we'll talk about how honeybees were imported into the United States, and that led to sort of a revolution of beekeeping here in the United States and here in Texas. But one thing that we recently found about 10 years ago was this fossil. This is probably from 45 million years ago, and it's known as Apis nearctica. And this fossil was found in Nevada. And so you talk about honeybees are not native to the United States. Well, maybe they are native to the United States, and they were found kind of around the Nevada area. And so this is probably this is the earliest known ancestor to Apis mellifera. Now, if you imagine Nevada, millions and millions of years ago, it was sort of a tropical area. It's full of trees. It was a very moist area, and so it's not what it appears now. It's sort of a tropical area similar to Southeast Asia. And we think about where most of the bees, whether they're honeybees or stingless bees, come from. The diversity is coming from these tropical areas in Southeast Asia. And so what probably happened was Apis nearctica first emerged in Nevada in these tropical environments. But as the drought hit and as that tropical forest went away, they started migrating farther and farther west into into Asia, and then eventually spread across Europe and Africa. And so we're still learning more, but it does appear that these bees may actually originate in the United States and actually may be native to the United States. Now, one thing that we want to do is, well, and actually, if you look at this fossil, you can see that you see the corbiculate right here. So this is a palm basket, so it's clearly an Apis mellifera. You can see the wing right here, and it has all these similarities to Apis mellifera. Now, one thing we want to do is, if you've ever done a genetic testing, maybe 23andMe test, it can tell you how much Neanderthal genetics you have in your genome. We'd like to do the same thing with honeybees. So can we go to maybe the forests of New Mexico or certain areas where there's less managed colonies and see if some of these honeybee colonies have some of these Apis nearctica genetics. And so that's sort of the next step, and it'd be cool to learn more about that. And maybe even the southern part of Texas, there could be some Apis nearctica genetics in some of your bees that we're just not detecting or measuring at this point. But one thing I want to note too here is that um, when you think of the Mayan beekeeping, it's interesting because they use wax for a lot of religious ceremonies. Now, the problem with the wax from these stingless bees is they're full of resin. And so if you ever heat up this wax and make candles, it turns kind of a dark black color because it burns it because of all the resin inside the wax. And if you look at some of the reports from the Mayan beekeepers, they had that kind of light, yellowish, whitish wax that we all use and we all see as beekeepers if we ever render our wax. And so it does appear that the Mayan bee people were managing potentially honeybee colonies really early on. So not just stingless bees, but maybe they're managing some of the earliest descendants of honeybees like Apis nearctica. So we're s- we're still learning more, but when we think about are honeybees native to the United States, then the fact may be, well, maybe they are native, and we're still learning more about that. Okay, so the first part was talking about everything before the 1600s. You think about beekeeping and honeybees before the 1600s, they're primarily beekeepers in Europe, Africa, and Asia. They're managing for honey production in skeps or clay or mud colonies. But starting around the 1600s, honeybees spread into the New World or into the United States. So honeybees were first imported into the United States around 1622 in Virginia. And so this was the Apis mellifera mellifera or the dark-termed honeybee. And so these massive importation events started around the 1600s. And as you can see from this map, it slowly spread across the United States. And by the 1850s, honeybees were found in every state and every part of the United States. And so if you look at this kind of the darkish brownish color, everything from 1600s to around 1820, everything right here, these are all importation events from Apis mellifera mellifera or the dark-termed honeybee. But starting around probably the mid 1800s, beekeepers started importing Italian honeybees and Carnival honeybees because there's a lot of issues with the dark-termed honeybee. One, they were more aggressive. Two, they produce less honey, and they didn't do as well here in the New World versus in Europe. And so beekeepers started importing Italian honeybees and Carniolan honeybees. But also because the winters were so harsh in certain parts of the United States. So if you go to Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, the Dakotas, the Italian honey, the Apis mellifera dark germ honeybees did not perform as well. So they wanted a more cold, hardy stock. Now, talk about specific importation events into Texas, but the first honeybee that was imported to Texas was 1821, Apis mellifera mellifera into East Texas. And then 1834 was another importation event into Texas, Apis mellifera mellifera. And now talk about around the 1880s when Italian honeybees were introduced. So these are really the five major subspecies introduced into the United States. The major one was Apis mellifera lagusica. Importation events started around 1880s across the entire United States. And like I mentioned beforehand, one reason that people really like the Italian honeybees because they're really docile. And if you ever manage Italian honeybees, they're really easy to work with. You almost don't even need a veil or a bee suit. And so people really love them. They also produce and hoarded large amounts of honey. So they could produce, 2 to 3 times more honey than the dark germ honeybees. So they started importing a lot more of these Italian honeybees before that. And you think about beekeeping before, 1987, before Varroa and a lot of diseases, this was a really great bee and a really great stock to have. Carniolan honeybees were introduced right around the same time as Italian honeybees, around the late 1890s, early 1900s. These were introduced primarily because they were more cold hardy, and more resistant to a lot of pest pathogens and diseases. And so a lot of people, beekeepers, started liking these Carniolan honeybees versus Italian honeybees. The black bees or dark German honeybees were introduced in 1622. And so before the 1880s, basically all of our bees in the United States were these black bees or the dark German honeybees. And there's still a current breeding program in Germany that still maintains the stock. And so there's definitely some benefits of them. They're more hardy, but their major issue was they're really short tongues. So that issue with a lot of our native plants here in Texas and across the United States. They were a bit more aggressive versus Carniola and Italian honeybees, so people didn't like to manage them as much. And so they had a lot of downsides to them. And right now, most of the genetics have been replaced by Italian and Carniola. And so if we actually sequence your bees, I say about 5% of your genetics are probably this dark German honeybee, and the other 80% are probably Italian and Carniolan. Africanized honeybees, specifically Apis mellifera scutellata, were introduced into Brazil in 1851 and made its way into Texas around the 1990s. And now most of the bees across Texas have at least a little bit of Africanized genetics. Some may have 5%, some may have 20 to 30%, but I haven't found any that are 100% Africanized. Some may be 60 to 70%, but most of them are hybrids with Africanized honeybees, Italian honeybees, Carniolan, and black bees. Caucasian honeybees, we see a little bit of their genetics. There's some breeding programs here in the United States that do maintain Caucasian honeybees. They're very docile, so they're really easy to work with. So for new beekeepers, they really do prefer Caucasian honeybees, and they're even more docile and gentler than Italian honeybees. They do produce less honey, and so that's why a lot of beekeepers prefer the Italian honeybees because they produce more honey than the Caucasian honeybees, but they are a bit more cold hardy versus Italian honeybees. But about all the genetics of your bees, they're probably a mixture and a mutt of these five different subspecies. So these were the different importation events into Texas. And so the first honeybee colonies introduced into Texas was the dark bee in 1821 in the Trinity River. I'm not sure exactly what part of the Trinity River. The only reports I could find was it was in the Trinity River. So I'm not sure which part of the Trinity River, but 1821 was the first known importation event into Texas. And even when I did some research on Native Americans, there was no reports of any Native Americans managing bee colonies in Texas. The report started around 1821 and really around 1830 when the first colonies, like Austin colonies, started forming in Texas. Italian honeybees were first imported into Texas in 1881 in Beeville. Now, kind of a fun fact about Beeville. I looked into that because I was curious, like, why do they call it Beeville? It was some person name. I think her name was Nancy B. And so they named the county Bee County after her. So it had nothing to do with bees, had nothing to do with honeybees. It was just kind of named after her last name. But around the 1880s to early 1900s, this was sort of the epicenter of beekeeping across the entire nation, even the entire world was Beeville. And as we look in into all these importation events, the beekeepers are importing a lot of these different stocks from across the world into Beeville. So if you're located around the Beeville area, you could have some of these genetics in your stocks, especially if you're open mating and your queens are mating with some of these feral stocks. So Italian honeybees were first imported into Beeville in 1881. The Cyprian honeybee was introduced into Beeville around 1905. Carniolan honeybees was introduced in Beeville around 1905. Syriaca was introduced in Beeville in 1905 also. Um, I haven't seen any Syriaca genetics. I've done a lot of sequencing and I haven't seen any Syriaca. So I'd be curious to work with some beekeepers in the Beeville area to see if some of those Syriaca genetics are still out there, and even some of the Cyprian genetics. And then Apis scutellata made its way into Texas and Hidalgo in 1990, and then eventually spread across Texas. So these are all the importation events in Texas. So some of the earliest beekeepers were in Texas for around 1836, and so as the colonies started forming in Texas, such as the Austin colony, the Tennessee colony, they started importing bees into the state of Texas. And so as you can see around 1821, these are a result of people migrating to Texas to start forming the early stages of the Austin colony and some of the other colonies across Texas. But one thing that people started doing as sort of an activity was known as beelining. Now, there's some really cool videos of beelining. If you've read any Tom Seeley studies, he was a professor at Cornell University. He wrote a lot of really great books, including Honeybee Democracy, and he talked a lot about beelining. And so what he did was he was trying to find all the feral colonies in the Arnett Forest in the northern part of New York. And one way he found these feral colonies was this task known as beelining. So what this means is a bee is going to a plant, and what he does is he catches that bee and then moves it closer and closer until he finds the feral colony. And this beelining activity is a really great way for Dr. Tom Seeley to find these honeybee colonies. But these beeliners have been around for hundreds of years. And so starting around 1836, there's a lot of beeliners that use this as activity. It's sort of a challenge when they were bored because these people would be really great at finding a bee flying and tracking exactly where that feral colony is to collect the honey and the wax. And you probably think that they were beeliners or bee hunters because of the honey and wax. They really did it more as an activity because they were bored. And so they used it as sort of a competition between people in the colony to see who was the fastest one to find that bee colony. Now, one interesting thing about beeliners was Davy Crockett when he made his way down to the Alamo in 1836. He used bee hunters to make his way all the way down to the Alamo because he was coming from Tennessee. He didn't know Texas as well, and he wanted to make his way all the way down to San Antonio. But he didn't know the area that well. So he found a lot of local beekeepers, known as bee hunters, help him navigate all the way down to San Antonio. And so if you read some of the early writings about David Crockett, there's a lot of really great writings about him using bee hunters to make his way all the way down to San Antonio. And so, these local bee hunters knew the area really well because they could find one bee flying around and locate that feral colony within hours. And so they're really great at finding bee colonies, but also they knew the area very well. Uh, David Crockett also camped in the Grove. So, and this is what he said. He said it's so full of bees and honey seems heaven blessed because there's this area in Honey Grove, Texas, and it's named after this because there's a whole grove of trees and it's full of feral colonies around him. And so they named it Honey Grove, Texas. And it was sort of a lot of feral colonies in Texas around 1836 because once the bees were imported in 1821, they rapidly spread across Texas and they formed a lot of feral colonies across, especially the eastern part of Texas. But early settlers turned tracking bees into fun and competitive activities. But yeah, even before this, there wasn't any reports that I could find about Native Americans that were managing honeybee colonies, even after honeybees were imported into Texas around 1821 to the 1830s. Native Americans didn't really take up beekeeping, and even some of the early settlers, they weren't necessarily beekeepers. They didn't have skeps, they didn't have like these clay pots. They were just collecting honey and wax from the trees. So the beeline is really important for finding the honeybee colonies. But even for the honey that they were collecting, they did use it as a partial sweetener, but it wasn't like a major part of their food products. And so, a lot of times they would mix it with some of their meat products. They mix it with some of their food as a sweetener. But most time with beekeeping, it was used more of an activity from what I read and what I found. So here's some discoveries across the world around 1600 to 1855. So in 1568, Nickel Jacob in Germany discovered that honeybees could raise queens from young larvae. So, Nickel Jacob was really the first one to find out that you can actually start raising your own queen. So he's one of the first and earliest queen grafters. In 1586, Luis Mendez de Torres in Spain discovered that queens were female. In 1609, Charles Butler in England found that drones were males. In 1637, Richard Remnant found that workers were also females. And then Francis Huber, he was a Swiss beekeeper. And if you have a chance to read his book, it's published in 1792 and sort of a story about his life. But he was a blind beekeeper. He was a trained entomologist, but he couldn't see. But he had all these really fantastic discoveries that laid the groundwork for us as beekeepers now. And you're probably wondering, like, how does a blind beekeeper make all these discoveries and find out that bees made outside the colony? What he would do is he had like a translator. So he had somebody that sat next to him and described everything they were saying, and it would write down all of his thoughts and all of his notes. And so if you have a chance to read the book, it's really fascinating and to learn how this blind beekeeper made all these really important discoveries. So, learning about honeybee colonies, learning about mating, because before this, they thought honeybees mated within the colony so that the queen and males found each other in the colony and mated with each other. But this blind beaker was the first one to note that they flew outside the colony, mated in the air, and then reproduced that way. Now we get into kind of 1852 to 1987. So you think about the different areas. Talk about before 1600s, right? Beekeepers are managing them in, skeps, in clay colonies, in mud colonies. Um, and that was still really the case up until 1952. But around 1951, Lorenzo Langstroth really invented the removable frame hive. And so he read a lot of really great books, including Huber's book as a blind beekeeper about his discoveries. He read a lot about skeps and keeping bees. Um, and what he did was he read those books and started managing, bee colonies and skeps. And what he found was the specific bee space. So he found that when honeybee colonies were building their wax combs, there was a specific gap and specific space between those wax combs. And he basically discovered the bee space, which stands for 3/8 of an inch. So the wax has to be 3/8 of an inch. And this discovery was really a game changer for beekeepers because it allowed us to kind of build these removal frames and allowed us to move these removal frames for hive inspections, to move it for honey extraction. And this discovery really changed beekeeping forever. And so this is probably gonna be a question on the test talking about Langstroth and discovery of the Langstroth colony in 1851, and more importantly, the discovery of the bee space, because this changed how we keep bees today. And we're still managing Langstroth colonies now. So if you have a honeybee colony with movable frames, it's all because of this discovery by Lorenzo Langstroth in 1851. But yeah, it really led to more efficient honey production and management, laying the foundation for modern beekeeping. Because before this, beekeepers had to cut out all the comb and remove all the wax and the honey. And so by doing that, you basically kill off the entire colony. But this allows you to keep bees, remove the frames, extract the honey without destroying the entire colony. So this really changed beekeeping forever. This was the original Langstroth colony, so you can see that has the removable frames. It has the boxes that can swivel in and out, and so this was the first Langstroth colony design. As you can see, it's a lot different than what we have now, but it was a really important discovery. Now, Langstroth was from Philadelphia, so he was American, and so this discovery in Langstroth colony spread rapidly across the United States. And by 1861, this became the primary beekeeping method for beekeepers across the U.S. But then T.W. Woodbury introduced removal frames in England around 1862, and then through Charles Dadant's writings in French and Italian journals, it spread across the entire United States. So really by the 1870s, beekeepers across the world were transitioning from skeps and clay colonies into these Langstroth colonies. But the discovery of Langstroth colonies also led to some additional discoveries. So Johannes Mehring in Germany produced the first beeswax foundation. And so with the removable frames, we can make artificial wax foundation to put into those frames. So they made Johannes made a beeswax foundation for these frames. And then this also led to the discovery of the first honey extractor in 1865 by Franz von Hruschka. And so this allowed beekeepers to remove the frames, spin the honey out, and put the frames back into the colony. And so the Langstroth colony led to all these subsequent developments like the wax foundation and the honey extractor. And then 1891, E.C. Porter in the United States made the first bee escape. So we talked about bee escapes. I think last week with the products of the colony for honey extraction. This isn't a great method for Texas, but a lot of beekeepers in the northern climates use this. So you put this in between the brood boxes and the honey supers, and on the cold nights, the bees move from the honey supers into the box and and the next day they can't move back into the honeybee colony because it's a one-way track. So the bees are able to move in one way, but they can't go back another way. So a lot of beekeepers put these bee escapes between the honey supers and the brood boxes, leave on for 24 hours so the bees move to the bottom boxes, and then next day they come back and remove the honey. Now it has to be a cold night in order for the bees to move down. So because Texas is really warm, we have warmer nights versus other parts of the United States, then this method doesn't work as well. But this really was a great game changer, made it easier to remove those frames because before that, they had a lot of bees that were still in the wax, but this allowed them to get all the bees out of the boxes to spin the honey and extract the honey. This also led to the development of a lot of bee supply stores. So A.I. Root, he was located in Medina, Ohio. If you go to the town, it's kind of outside Cleveland. I think an hour and a half, 2 hours outside of Cleveland, Ohio. But he's one of the first pioneers of beekeeping and made. He was involved with a lot of the books like Bee Culture magazine. He led to the development of Bee Culture magazine and some of the major beekeeping books. And he also formed a store in San Antonio around 1905. And so he had a major supply store in San Antonio. And really, because of the supply store, it led to a lot of beekeepers, led to the development of the Texas Beekeeper Association, and led to the Texas becoming really the epitome of beekeeping in the early 1900s. Because if you look at the early 1900s, one reason they brought the bee supply store down to Texas, especially San Antonio area, is because most of the beekeepers were in the southern part of Texas. Most of the honey produced was found in Texas, and so Texas was really the epitome of beekeeping in the early 1900s. Another founder of bee supplies was Charles Dadant, and so he founded Dadant and Sons in 1836, and was also another major player in beekeeping supply industry. They currently have a store in Paris, Texas, so the northern part of Texas, right around the border of Oklahoma and Texas. So here's just kind of pictures of them. This is Charles Dadant, and this is A.I. Root. Okay, then we talk about Texas beekeepers. So the first known, and this was I found maybe there's maybe Doty or somebody else knows about the first Texas State Beekeepers Conference, but from what I found, the first Texas Bee Conference was 1874 in Greenville, Texas, which is right near Paris, Texas. The first Southwest Beekeeper Association was located in Beeville, Texas, around 1880. And the Texas Beekeeper Association officially formalized around 1880. So at the time, there was about three separate clubs, and eventually they merged into one Texas Beekeeper Association around 1880. So the three separate clubs were the one in Greenville, Texas, the Southwest Association in Beeville, Texas, and then the Central Texas Association in Temple, Texas. But then by 1880, they formulated into what we like to know now as the Texas Beekeeper Association, which serves thousands of members across the state of Texas and was a really major player for forming this position and formulating the Texas Master Beekeeping Program. But it all started in 1880. One thing I always like to mention is the Texas Diana. So there's a honeybee historian in 1950 or so. He was located at the university, I think Oklahoma State University, and he wrote a lot about the history of beekeeping in Texas. And one thing he wrote a lot about is the Texas Dianas. And if you actually want a copy of his thesis, I actually had to go to the SMU library in Dallas and print off his thesis because he passed away and it's not available online. But I have the entire thesis right now. It's hundreds of pages, but he wrote all about the history of beekeeping in Texas. So if you want a copy of that, I'm happy to maybe transcribe that to a document that you guys can all read. But one thing he talked a lot about were the Tex Dianas, and these were three women beekeepers. Three beekeepers that were women in Texas that were really the pioneers of beekeeping in the state of Texas. So oh, also Beeconomy. This was written by Dr. Tammy Potter Horn, and she also wrote a lot about the Textianas in her book. She talks a lot about the role that women played in beekeeping and how they played a really vital role in how we keep bees and manage bees across the United States. So I do recommend buying this book and reading this book. It's really fascinating, and they have a whole section just on Texas beekeeping. But yeah, she also wrote about Textianas. So Diana was a Greek god. And Diana was known as a bee hunter and a really important beekeeper. And so they use this term because there's about three major players of beekeeping in the state of Texas. So after the Civil War, many women were left as widows or had husbands that were maimed or wounded. And so a lot of financial duties fell to a lot of women in the state of Texas after the Civil War. And this led to a lot of these women becoming beekeepers. But specifically, there's three more important players of beekeeping in Texas. We have Mrs. Sarah Elizabeth Sherman, Mrs. Jenny Ashley, and Florence Weaver were the most visibly successful commercial beekeepers in Texas right after the Civil War. So Sarah Elizabeth Sherman, this is a picture of her from the American Bee Journal. She was widowed in 1868 and then moved to Salado, Texas in 1870. And she became one of the Texas's first commercial honey producers. And she continuously harvested 6,000 pounds of extracted honey from around 60 hives in four apiaries. So she was one of the first beekeepers and honey producers in the state of Texas. And it's all stemmed from her being a widow and having this financial burden. And so she moved to beekeeping as a way to make some extra money and to make finances work. We have Jenny Ashley. So Jenny Ashley operated somewhere between 1,800 to 1,000 colonies in Beeville, focused exclusively on raising queens. So her queens sold for up to $100 in 1890. And so if you think about $100, that's a lot of money, but she had a really valuable stock. And she was really the pioneer and one of the major reasons why a lot of beekeepers were imported into Beeville specifically. And so because of her role in queen rearing and raising quality queens for Texas beekeepers, she played a major role in importing a lot of these stocks into the state of Texas. So including Italian honeybees, Carniolan, and all these different stocks I wrote about. She also wrote a thesis, but she also was really important for writing about local bee forage and regional bee forage, specifically in the Southwest Texas hills as the best honey producing area. Jenny raised 10 children, all of whom would run beekeeping operations at their home. She founded the Southland Queen magazine. I forget when it ended. I think around 1910 or so, but you can find all these copies. I think the Texas Beekeeper Association has all the copies of Southland Queen. So if you're a historian, you're interested of how people viewed beekeeping in the late 1800s to early 1900s, I recommend reading some of these Southland Queen journal articles. It's really fascinating and it's really cool for me to read about the history of beekeeping in Texas. Um, but yeah, she founded the magazine, which later merged to the Lone Star Apiarist before the family relocated to California in 1904. Now, after Jenny Ashley moved to California, apparently she stopped beekeeping, and so most of her beekeeping really ended around 1904. But she's a really major pioneer for helping import that stocks and establishing beekeeping in the southern part of the U.S. And then we have Florence Weaver. So Florence Summerford, she brought 8 hives with her in 1892 to her marriage with Zachariah Weaver in Navasota, Texas, gifted by her brother Walter. So her Walter was got really interested in beekeeping, and Walter gave Florence eight beehives. And so when the marriage between Florence Sommerfeld and Zachariah arose, she brought eight colonies. And that really started the Weaver Bee Company. So a lot of you may buy queens or bees from the Weavers, and it really started around 1892 with the marriage between Florence and Zachariah Weaver. They really shared a love for beekeeping and they pooled their money together to buy ABC and XYZ of bee culture and subscribe to the gleanings of bee culture. So talk about AI Root, for example. AI Root started the magazine Gleanings of Bee Culture. He brought his bee supply store down to the southern part of Texas and San Antonio, and he also wrote the book ABC and XYZ of Bee Culture. And if you ever buy that book, I actually have it right here. They're on the 42nd. I don't know if you can see this actually. They have the 42nd edition, so I have a copy of it. And it's a really great book to read. But yeah, they bought this book in the original edition and learned a lot about beekeeping from there. And then from there, they took over raising her siblings after their mother's death, using honey and beeswax to help support the household. And then the Weavers found a world-renowned international bee business that still shapes Texas beekeeping today. So they're probably one of the most influential beekeepers in the state of Texas. And here's a picture from International Beekeepers Congress, and you can see a picture of Zachariah Weaver and then Florence Weaver right here in the back. And I think this conference was in San Antonio, I believe. I forget. But here's a picture of some of the earliest beekeepers in the kind of early 1900s, I believe. And here's a picture of the other Weavers too. So Zachariah. What actually did I mention? Yeah, yeah. So one thing I should mention is Walter, which was Florence's brother, he moved to Cuba for honey production, and then Florence got really interested in raising queens and raising queens for beekeepers in Texas. So got really interested in raising queens, whereas her brother Walter, who was the one that really got her interested in beekeeping and moved to Cuba for honey production. And here's a picture of Roy, which was Florence's son, and then grandson Binford. Okay, so that's a little bit of history of the major players of beekeeping in the state of Texas. And I know there's a huge history of beekeepers afterwards, but those are probably the three major players of beekeeping, the Texas Dianas. Now, one thing that came with removable frames was the spread of diseases. And so, because these frames weren't being culled and removed every single year when beekeepers were extracting honey and wax, this led to frames being moved across beekeepers and sold to multiple beekeepers. Now, this is really great because you wouldn't have to have the bees make new wax every single year. But the downside was the spread of diseases, specifically American foul brood. Now, this was the biggest issue in beekeeping from the early 1900s up until right around 2005, really. This was the biggest issue facing beekeepers, not only in the United States, but across the entire world. And because of these removable frames, this American foul brood spread across the US. And because they formed these spores, it spreads really rapidly. So after this became a really big issue, there's mandates for removable frames. And so now here in Texas, one reason we can't manage bees in a tree, we can't manage bees in skeps, we can't manage bees in trees, for example, is because of American foul brood, because we need to actually remove those frames and do an inspection for the American foul brood. And a lot of states implemented comb laws, so meaning that you can't bring comb in and out of the state. And most states have gotten rid of that comb law, but Alabama still has that. So if you want to move bees to Alabama, you're not legally allowed to. And so in Alabama, those beekeepers actually can't buy nooks from outside the state and bring it to the state of Alabama because of the comb laws. You can buy packages and have them build comb within the state, but you're not allowed to bring comb in the state from another state. And so a lot of states are implementing this comb law to really um, I guess, lower the spread of American foul brood across the U.S. But this also led to the formation of the Texas Apiary Inspection Service, which was formed in 1901. This is a brand new Texas Master Beekeeping logo. So I talk a little about the history of Texas A&M Extension, and so the 27th legislature of the state of Texas in 1901 appropriated $750 for the establishment and maintenance of experimental apiary. And so really the first honeybee researcher and extension personnel was in 1901. And the person who was selected for the position was Mr. Wilmon Newell, was selected as assistant entomologist in February and was given immediate charge of the apiary. And so his goal was really to assess the forage across state Texas. So he traveled across state Texas and he found which plants that bees liked, and he also tasted the honey and gave a really great profile on honey. And he wrote a book about it. I don't know if you can see this. Let me see. You can buy this on Amazon. Sorry about that. Let me get rid of my blur. He wrote this really good book, so you can buy this off Amazon. He wrote all about his findings around 1901 to 1905 based on that $750. So it's really good. It's really short. It's only about 30 pages, but it tells a lot about his findings. And this was really the first honeybee specialist in the state of Texas. And from there on, they actually established a bee lab in San Antonio. Since then, it's been torn down, but around 1930, they had like 3 to 4 buildings. They had about 100 colonies, and they're doing a lot of really great research. And really, after 1930, the program went away, and I was the first person to really take up the honeybee extension program. So really, for the past 100 years, we didn't have the honeybee extension program, but from 1901 to around 1933, there was a extension program from Texas A&M. Now we get into 1987, and this is when beekeeping really changed forever for really a lot of different reasons. So, one, beekeepers started keeping bees as their primary form of income. They started migrating and shipping bees across the entire state of Texas. There's a lot of other challenges associated with beekeeping, including varroa, and other diseases. And so, really, after 1987, a lot of things changed with beekeeping. So I talked about the slide kind of a few weeks ago, but the varroa mites, they're the small parasitic mites that feed on the fat body of bees and transmit a lot of deadly viruses and pathogens. Their original host was Apis cerana, and they jumped host into Apis mellifera. Um, Around 1904. And over the next about 80 or so years, Varroa spread across the entire world. And so they made its way into India in 1961, China in 1959, Germany in 1977, and then finally into the United States in 1980, 87. And so once it got to the United States, and because beekeeping had become migratory by 1987, the Varroa might spread rapidly across the United States and became a really big issue that they really faced then, but even became a really big issue that we face now. And so we think about the biggest global problem and the biggest issue that beekeepers face now is the varroa mites. It all started because they jumped host and then made its way into the United States around 1987. And so this really led to a lot of different things. So led to beekeepers having to treat and manage their colonies. So beekeepers started using miticides to treat and kill mites. This led to more intensive management because it became harder and harder to keep bees alive. And so before 1987, the annual losses were probably around 15%, 12, 15%, and then jumped all the way to around 30 to 50% afterward. And so Varroa really changed beekeeping forever. Africanization also changed beekeeping. So right around when Varroa introduced, about a few years later, Africanized honeybees made its way into Texas, and they're it's commonly referred to as killer bees. I don't like that term, but that's what the media calls Africanized honeybees. But they first arrived into Texas around 1990s, and this led to a huge frenzy across, say, Texas and really across the country, because they're known for their heightened aggression and defensive behavior, more likely to sting in large numbers and cause some health issues if you're stung a lot of times. And so, you know, Africanized honeybees were probably a bigger problem back then because now beekeepers are importing so much stock into Texas that we have more of a hybrid now. But when you have these pure Africanized stocks, they tend to be a bit more aggressive. And then one thing that really changed beekeeping was almonds and pollination. So the really the first beekeepers to ship bees for pollination was in almonds was the 80s in 1992. So that's when pollination in almonds really started, but it really ramped up around 2001 and into the 2010s. And this is when there's a lot more people get into beekeeping as a business and started to include, almond pollination on their migratory route. So, I'm from North Dakota, and so there were some early beekeepers in North Dakota, And what they would do is they would manage their honeybee colonies, extract all the honey, and then the bees would die in the winter. They buy new packages and start their honeybee colonies once again. But once almond pollination become a viable income for a lot of beekeepers, they're able to ship bees across the entire country to California, where one, it's warmer, but they can make some extra money off almonds. Because it's really hard to support your business just on, honey production. And nuke production wasn't very big back in the 1900s because there just wasn't as many beekeepers. And so beekeepers are relying primarily on honey as their primary form of income. But once almonds came in, that's where beekeepers were able to be more sustainable. More people got into beekeeping, and that led to a huge influx of beekeepers across the entire country. That also led to beekeepers managing large and larger amounts of colonies. And so typically around the 1900s, beekeepers were managing maybe a few thousand colonies, whereas now you see some beekeepers managing somewhere between 30 to 100,000 colonies. And so a lot of people got into beekeeping, managing larger numbers of colonies, and started migrating across the entire country. And almonds really, really changed that. And this is just kind of a typical migratory route of a Texas beekeeper. It kind of depends on the beekeeper, but typically, they're kind of in Texas in the spring, so right around now, beekeepers are splitting their colonies, raising queens, and preparing them for honey production. And then beekeepers ship them to North Dakota for honey production or somewhere in the Midwest. Sometimes they ship them to Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Michigan, Indiana, kind of this whole Midwest area. And they keep the bees up there during the summertime for honey production, and mainly because these bees will produce somewhere between 120 to 250 pounds of honey per colony. So it's a really great place for honey production. And then the beekeepers started shipping them to California for pollination, primarily almond pollination, and then they ship back to Texas to repeat the process. And so almond pollination really changed a lot with beekeeping and made beekeeping more profitable and more of a really great business protocol. Because if you actually look before 1987, before migratory beekeeping, honey prices were just so low that the government really had to subsidize honey prices to support beekeepers. And so a lot of people got out of beekeeping around, I think 1984, 1985 or so. But once almond pollination became viable around late 1990s, 2001, a lot of people got into beekeeping afterwards. One other discovery was the honeybee genome. Now, fun fact, the bee weavers, their bee was the first honeybee sequence in the entire world. And so you think about the genome I use for research and all the people across the world use for research, it's based on a Texas bee in Navasota, which is really, really cool. And the first honeybee genome was sequenced in 2006, and it gave a lot of possibility because with knowing the honeybee genome, can we use this for genetic testing? Can we understand the traits? And can we, more importantly, breed a better bee? And so the honeybee genome has been really a big game changer. Now the question is, what's beekeeping look like in 21, 25, and 100 years? So there are these kind of four different eras before 1600s, 1600 to 1851, 1852 to 1987, and then up to now. So I asked AI to make me a photo of what beekeeping will look like in 100 years, and this is what it came out to be. I really like it's kind of funny. So you see all the nuclear plants in the background. We're still managing lengths of colonies through removable frames. So I guess apparently AI doesn't think that's going to change much. You can see all these colors. Some of these are hive sensors on the hive colony, and I can't tell if this is a robot or just a bee suit. If this is a bee suit, it seems very hot, but maybe they have robots just keeping bees. Who knows? But um, yeah, I mean, but it looks like a lot has changed, but still the colonies are managed exactly the same. So I'm not sure much will change in 100 years, but if you have any thoughts of what you think beacons will look like in 100 years, please let me know and send it in the chat. And here's some future innovation that could change beekeeping forever. So what's going to be the next innovation in beekeeping? So artificial intelligence. So can we use it to predict colony health? Can we put sensors in colonies to predict which ones will die, which ones will live? Can we use it for breeding and so on? We're already seeing a lot more of these smart hives. So sensors that go into the colony that can measure how much honey colony produces per day, has temperature and humidity sensors. It has sensors for frequencies to measure the sound of the bees. So a lot of these really cool smart hives. There's also entire colonies that are managed by a robot. And so they're currently managed in California, where basically the robot can take each frame out and then spray the bees with a treatment. You can also extract the honey, and so basically removes the beekeeper out of the equation. Blockchains for traceability. So can we use these blockchains to track where honey comes from? So we talk about local honey, and how hard it is to track local honey. Can we use blockchains to trace honey and basically inform the consumer about where honey comes from? So I've done a lot of research on blockchains and learning more about how we can use this to, um, know more about local honey, where honey comes from. I think one of the future innovations are vaccines. So there's a new vaccine that came out for American foulbrood, but can we develop a vaccine for a lot of the other challenges? So a vaccine for the viruses that kill colonies, vaccine for other bacterial and fungal diseases. So I think vaccines have a lot of potential. Maybe new and modern rural treatments, unmanned aerial vehicles or mechanical drones. So this is a picture of our apiary here in Overton, and what we're trying to do is find where queens and drones mate. So we made a 3D map with this unmanned aerial vehicle or mechanical drone to find these DCAs. And so I think they have a lot of potential. You can also add sensors to them to measure how big a colony is. You can use sensors to measure how fast the colony grows, how much honey they produce. So there's a lot of potential. Genomics. So I talked about the first honeybee that was sequenced was in Navasota, Texas. But now we see that sequencing a honeybee is getting cheaper and cheaper. So you think about the first honeybee genome that was sequenced, it was like it was millions and millions of dollars. But now we can sequence an entire colony for, $5. So it's getting really cheap. Precision pesticides. So how can we reduce pesticides, but really reduce the off-target effects of pesticides? So pesticides are really big thing that could cause colony losses and something we hear a lot about in the news. So we can develop more precise pesticides to treat the pests, but not have this off-target effects on bees. GPS trackers for bees. So if we can put a small tracker device on the back of the bee, can we track where they fly, where they go, what florist resource we're going? And I think these GPS trackers will be available just for the back of the bee in the next 5 years or so. And then precision supplements. So can we basically design a specific supplement for your colonies based on where you're located and based on the health of the colony? So if you know a lot about the cattle producers, they get specific supplements based on the health of their cattle and health of their herd and based on where they're located. Now, can we do the exact same thing for beekeepers? That remains to be seen. Now, one thing I'm really interested in is next generation breeding. And so, these are the major steps in breeding. And so some of you may have heard this talk already, so I'll kind of briefly cover it. And so every single industry goes through these major steps in breeding, from breeding 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0. 1.0 is where beekeepers currently are, and 3.0 is where I want beekeepers to get. So 1.0 basically means that you're measuring a trait on the colony and you're kind of grafting from that colony. So maybe you as a beekeeper say, this colony is the best colony, so I'm going to graft from it. Now, you can make breeding progress that way, but you're not getting the same results. So back in 1950s or so, a lot of cattle producers started using statistics because you could say using statistics that you should be basically breeding from these two cattle. Um, and so they started using statistics in their breeding program around 1957. And then right around 5, 10 years ago, they started using genomics. And so instead of measuring traits, so measuring honey production on a trait, measuring mite biting, measuring row resistance, can you just sequence a genome and say, okay, these colonies are going to be the best honey producers. These colonies are going to be the row resistant, virus resistant, instead of actually measuring all the traits. And so one of my goals is, can we use genomic breeding to sequence a honeybee colony and tell beekeepers which colonies to graft from? So I think it's the next step, and we'll probably be there in the next 1 to 5 years. And this kind of shows you the progress and really the game by using genomic breeding. So as you can see with the breeding program, this is a Holstein breeding program where they're primarily breeding for milk production. And so they have a value gain each year. So every time you breed, you can increase the value of that cattle. So in 2000, 2004, you see that each cow each year made an average gain of $13 per year. So it was a little bit game, but it was a very small game. By 2005, 2009, when they started using genetic testing, the increased gain was about $36 a year per cow. But then once genetic breeding started launching, the average gain was about $83 per year. Now imagine you as a beekeeper, whether you do it as a hobby or whether you do it commercially, if you can make an extra $80-$30 per year on your bee colonies, how big that would be. And so that's why I say that you can make this massive gain by using genetic breeding. And I'm really excited to start implementing this here in Texas in the next year or so. Okay, well, this was kind of the really the last formal section. Next week is just kind of more review. So I will have a study guide available. I'll have some practice quizzes available, some cards available for you guys to review on. And we'll talk more about future testing events. We'll also talk about when we'll have the testing events. So I'm thinking probably later in the summertime. But we do have a few testing events that are coming up here shortly. So if you have 1 year of beekeeping experience and you want to take the test sooner rather than later, we'll have one in Abilene. And I think it's June 17th for the Texas Beekeeper Association Summer Clinic. We're gonna have another testing event in San Antonio in about the second week of October, not October, but May. And then we'll probably have a lot of other testing events probably in August, September. So we'll have one in Overton in East Texas. We'll have a testing event in Dallas, one in Houston, one in San Antonio, and then one in West Texas. So we'll start planning that here shortly. We're hoping somewhere around August or September. So with that, I will take any questions. Steve, you had a question?
Yeah, so for the Abilene show, or is there something that we need to do to say
Register?
that we want that test?
Yeah, I will send an email and I'll have you guys sign up. So since you guys already paid, you don't have to pay for the testing event. So we'll get your name on the list. So yeah, after this, I'll send a link for anybody that wants to take the testing at Abilene to sign up.
The summer clinic is June 21st, so I think the testing is maybe the 20th,
No, it's actually, yeah, 20th. Yep.
day before.
Yeah, and Dodi, you want to talk a little bit about the social hour afterwards? Because well, the testing day before, but then there's a social hour in the afternoon that it's you need to pay a ticket for. It would be cool if you're taking the test to attend that social hour.
It sure would. It's going to be at a local barbecue joint that we're taking over for the night, and the event is called I think it's called Honey and Smoke or Smoke and Honey, something like that. It's going to be an expensive plate because all the proceeds, and we're buying the barbecue, so your whole ticket price is going to go to a donation to Project Apis M. We're going to have, what's going to be fun about it is that we're going to have Monica Shiviak, our Texas official Texas honey judge, is making pairings right now. She's working with Tiffany Herlick, and I'm throwing in some wildflower honey from Central Texas, but I think we're going to have wildflower and cotton and a couple of other honeys, and we're going to have pairings with cheese and fruits and stuff, and just have a whole um, like a pre-meal kind of appetizer of honey pairings with different things for fun. And then we'll have our barbecue dinner. And during our barbecue dinner, we'll have representatives from Project Apis M coming and talking to us about the current colony bee losses and what all they've found out about what's going on at that point. And that'll be the night before the summer clinic. So yes, please, if you're planning to come to summer clinic, come a little early and have dinner with everybody beforehand.
Yeah, and on the 20th, we'll probably have the testing starting around 1 o'clock. And so everything will be done about 5 o'clock. And I think the social hour is a perfect time for maybe all the master beekeepers to get together and take a group photo. It also all the funding goes to a really great cause like Project Apis mellifera. They fund a lot of my research, and they fund a lot of researchers across the US. But they also play a really important role for the tropicalatus work that we talked about last week. They do a lot of work for the whole industry in general. So I really recommend everyone making it. The location is Abilene, Texas. Where in Abilene is it, Dodie?
I think it's just like at the convention center. Hang on just
Okay.
a second. That because they've given us hotels, but I think the let me look real fast. It says DoubleTree by Hilton, Abilene Downtown Convention Center. So 500 Cypress Street, Abilene, Texas. If you go to the TBA website, the very top has a image that says Summer Clinic is heading west. If you click on that, you'll get all the information. Our keynote speaker is David Burns, so that'll be fun, y'all. Yeah, it's Smoke and Honey Gala. So that's what they're calling the dinner beforehand.
Billy said, "Is summer clinic available for all, not just the people to test?" Yeah, it's available for everybody, but we're adding the master beekeeping testing the day beforehand. So we just want to have more opportunities for testing, and I do understand Abilene maybe far for everybody, but it's a really great time. The summer clinic, there's a lot of really great speakers like David Burns, a lot of great workshops, and so it's a really great time to meet beekeepers, and it'd be cool to get all the master beekeepers together and take a group photo and just kind of meet everybody in person. Okay, said if we are testing, will we need to pay for the workshop? Is the apiary portion of the test on Saturday? No, okay, the all the testing will be the day beforehand on the 20th on that Friday. We're gonna plan it for probably about 1 p.m. So I'll send out more information soon if you want to attend that session. But one reason we did an afternoon so you don't take up a whole day for it. So we'll have the written portion and the in-high portion that day. And we'll talk more about the testing. So there's a few questions about what the testing involves. So Shane said, can you take the test online? No, it has to be in person because we have an in-high portion and a written portion. And so the in-high portion basically will bring you out to the colony. One, we make sure that you can light a smoker. Two, we have you inspect the colony and then identify everything in the colony. So can you identify what brood looks like, larva, a queen, drone, things like that? And then for the written portion, there's sort of a written and a practical. A practical is where we have a bunch of bee equipment out on a table, and you have to identify the different bee equipment. So can you identify this equipment versus this equipment? And then we'll have pictures of different pest pathogens, diseases. So can you recognize what a small hive beetle looks like, for example? For the written test, I'll have a study guide so you can see what that's all about. It's all multiple choice and true and false, so there's no written portion. And so it's about 50 questions, and you need, I think, a 70% to pass. But yeah, we'll talk all about that next week. So bring your questions then. There was a question. Oh, Ruby. What role is climate change having on varroa mites? Yeah, that's a good question. I think the biggest thing that's having is probably the longer brood, right? Because the one thing I talked about a couple weeks ago about managing varroa mites is you need to be broodless in order for the treatments to be more effective and more efficient. And so with maybe climate change, the colony may not be broodless as long. And that can make it harder to deal with the varroa mites. But I don't think it's directly impacting the varroa. More, it could be impacting the colony, impacting what nutrients they bring in, impacting the brood break. Oh, Amber said whatever book it was. Yeah, so this is the man. Sorry about that.
No, the next book, the
This
the
one?
one no, the one you said is only about 30 pages long. It was mostly yellow.
Yeah, this one right here. Can you see it now?
Oh, your page froze on the XYZ ABC book.
Oh,
Tell us what the title is so we can look it up.
okay. It's called A&M College Apiary, together with practical suggestions and modern methods of beekeeping as applied to Texas conditions by Fred Malley. So let me I'll post a link. I don't know if you see it now, but I'll post a link on Amazon if you want to buy it. Actually, here's on Walmart, but yeah, it's
Yeah. I found it. Yeah.
So Trudy said, if you fail the test, do you have to redo the whole apprentice course? No, no, you just have to retake the test. And if you fail the test, you have to pay for a separate test. So you can pay for that. You don't have to pay for it again. So you can take as many times as you want, and you have to pay for it ever again. You'll probably pass the practical part, but if you fail the written part, that's something we could potentially do online or find some location. Um, but also, if our testing events or like when we have our testing doesn't work out for you, we have apiaries in, Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio now, so everybody's hired on our team. And so if you can't make one of those dates, you can schedule with one of our program specialists to take the test then. I do recommend trying to make it to Summer Clinic or the Texas Beekeeper Association or some of our other testing events. But if you can't make it and you want to schedule testing with one of the program specialists, you can let me know and we can try to schedule something. Kay said, what about mega Day bees? Do you know anyone managing them? There's some commercial farmers in the Panhandle that manage Mega the leafcutter bees. I don't manage them, but I did a lot of management of those in North Dakota. We use those for alfalfa pollination, and so if you want some information, Kay, just shoot me an email. I can find you somebody. And then Jay Dirk Sheffer said, "Where can I find the testing place and times?" I'll send more information after this. So I'll send an email all of our testing events. So, I know we have one in San Antonio in May, one in the summer clinic in Abilene in June, and then we'll have about three probably in August or September. So I'll get all of the schedules so you guys have time dates for everybody for everything. I will also have one in, I believe, Waco in
Yeah,
November. In Waco.
November November convention is in Waco.
Yep. Yeah, and I recommend all you guys go to Waco. It's a really fun time. The state conference is probably my favorite conference. So regardless, I try to make that conference if you can. Okay. So I think Frank had a question. I think he came back on. Maybe not. Yeah, so Brooks, any update on the takes shipping? So I'll be shipping them out this week. So if you haven't signed for the takes, sign up for them now. But I'm getting everything printed now and getting them all on the envelopes. So we've had a few hundred people sign up for them, so it's taking me a little bit longer, but I'll get those out now. But if you want to do a hive inspection now and send me the sheet, you won't have the call and take number, but we can start doing that. So I'll send an email afterwards, and we'll talk more about it next week. But my goal is to have this all the takes shipped out probably by later this week. Okay. I think that's all the questions, unless I'm missing one.
Hey, Garrett, it's Dave, had to step away a little bit. I don't know if you discussed like mason bees. I had somebody ask me about mason bees,
Hmm.
pollinator, but not as a honey producer, I guess.
Yeah. Mason bees are really important pollinator, and a lot of them are native to Texas. They don't produce any honey, but they can be really great pollinators. Yeah.
They just
One
annuals. You have to buy new ones every year. That's
Pretty much, yeah. I've tried it before, so you can buy those nests and buy the straws, and I've had a tough time having to come back to that nest. And even when I buy one of those native bee hives, I never get bees established in them. So you can buy those straws and mason bees online, and then establish them in the spring, and they keep doing that every single year.
thanks. That's what it looked like.
The the Texas Bee Supply has a program for mason bees. You kind of rent them every year. So
Oh, you rent
check.
them?
I think so. I
Hmm.
have to look again, but he's got something up there. Check Blake's site and see what he's got about him. I'll see if I can find it.
Yeah, thanks. I had some friends that are interested in pollinators, but don't want to go through the whole honeybee process. And if it helps, like pollinate, local gardens or your backyard garden, it might be an interesting approach. Yeah.
Yeah, I think mason bees are good option, and they're really not that expensive either. So if you just have just one nest, buy maybe 20 straws. It's not terrible.
Great. Thanks.
So Kelly Brown says Colorado County has mason bee valuation. Is that true?
Yes, it is. Isn't that cool?
But
You
what does
can
that mean?
get
Like,
your ag valuation if you have mason bees instead of honeybees.
is it the same? So you have to have like 10 nests, and like what's the size requirements?
I do not know that
Interesting.
information.
Yeah, Kelly, if you know, I'm curious. I haven't heard about this.
Mm.
Oh, anyways, I'll just move on. Oh yeah, Mike's broke, I guess. Yeah, so a good question, like how long a time frame do you have to take the test after this class? There's really no time frame. So if you want to take it this year, if you want to take it next year, there's really no time frame, and you guys already paid for this course, and so whenever you guys are comfortable and ready to take the test, you can take that. And like I said, we'll have maybe I'll have a study session, maybe in a month or so. I'll send all the information next week, but maybe we'll have a study session just if you guys are thinking about testing for the Abilene and the summer clinic that we can kind of go over some of the questions. It's really not that hard. I think did you guys took all this 10-week course? I think you guys will be fine. Kent had a question.
Yes, I was just wondering, I was looking, trying to find the slide for that trophy slide that Hannah put out.
Yep.
Um, I could not get it pulled up. I mean, I saw the video when y'all first, put it in last week, but when I tried to get I guess the presentation, it was going through some third party or something, so I couldn't get
Oh,
the
it's
presentation up.
this might be the link that's going to Apis M's website. Yeah.
I touched slides though. So the slides didn't work?
Well, the slide that was presented last week, you can still pull it up and listen to it. But normally, when y'all start before the next class, y'all put the presentation
Mhm.
out where you can read it, and that's what I was looking for. But it kept popping me up saying that it was too large and
Oh.
wanted to go through three different, like cloud something and something through Google, and then there was like a third party or something. And when I clicked on them, I really couldn't get anything.
I,
Okay,
s-
let me try to
I
fix
see
it.
the
Do
problem. Yeah.
you have the problem too, Dodie?
Yeah, I see what he's talking about.
Okay. Yeah, let me try to fix that today. Thanks for letting me know.
Okay. And I had a couple of other questions. I wanted to talk, Heather, if I can get a chance to talk to you after the class.
I don't think Heather's on here, but I'll give her. She's getting a hitch installed. Let me
Oh, okay. Okay. I thought she was on. Okay.
she
Uh,
might be on, but I don't think she is. Do you have her email?
yes, I do. I'll just go ahead and email her.
Okay, perfect.
And I was looking at something about study guide,
Hmm.
and it was somewhere within the week of the 2 and the 5. I'm not for sure what that was.
Yeah, I'm gonna get all the study guides uploaded this week. I'm just a little bit behind, but I'll have just kind of a large study guide, and then
Okay.
I'll have maybe some practice quizzes that you can take online to kind of go over everything. But yeah, next week we'll basically go over the whole exam and what's gonna be on it, and I'll talk about the study guide and things you should prepare for.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's why I wanted to make sure if I'm missing anything that we're supposed to have other than
Mhm.
our presentations. If I'm missing something, I need to make sure and get it for studying for the exam.
Yep. No worries. I'll have that uploaded by next week, and then we'll talk about it all next week, and then maybe at some point we can all have just a study session again. I can kind of go over the exam right before you guys take it.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, Dave, thanks for sending this, Mason B. Um, yeah, Kay, I had a question. When does the next course start? Yeah, so if you guys are interested in past the apprentice level, you can take the advanced level next year. So I think I'm gonna have these 10-week courses, probably every spring from February to April. I think that worked out really well. And so the apprentice course was on Mondays, and then the advanced course will be on Tuesdays. And for that, we'll be covering, pollinators, pesticides, some of the more advanced topics. So yeah, if you guys want to take the next 10-week course and interested in pursuing the advanced level, we'll have that next year, probably around February. Okay, Brooks said, is there any content in the higher level courses that identify DCAs? Yeah. Well, we talk a lot more about breeding and queen rearing in the advanced level. So if you're interested in queen rearing, DCAs, queen breeding, we talk all that stuff in the advanced course. Tony said something about Saskatraz. Yeah, so Saskatraz is just a different breed. It was imported from Canada, and so some commercial producers in California produce Saskatraz queens. Billy said, "Will the resource from the chat be available?" Yes. I believe Heather's been uploading all the chats. Okay, perfect. Well, if you have any other questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer them. But next week, it's totally optional. But I'll have all the study guides uploaded. I'll talk to you a bit more in detail about what the exam entails. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.